Welcome to the One Within All to another episode of InnerVerse. I'm your host, Chance, and I'm grateful for another day to explore life's many beautiful mysteries. And when we talk about the world's most compelling conundrums and epic enigmas, there are very few riddles that have stood the test of time and sparked as many imaginations as the story of Atlantis. In New Age circles and general fringeology, Atlantis seems to always be inserted somewhere in the big story of who we are and how we got here. And over the years, I've heard many kinds of claims about this ancient watery kingdom, everything from advanced technology and genetic manipulation to stories about the Atlantean downfall being caused by their attempts to copulate with dinosaurs. One thing most of these ridiculous, albeit entertaining accounts have in common is that most of the people spreading them haven't even got the first clue as to just where the Atlantis myth originates from, as they happily pack on some more tall tales and push the snowball down the mountain. But from a rational, reasonable, and most importantly, truthful perspective, what do we really know about the existence of an archaic nation called Atlantis? And can we do anything to further that knowledge with actual evidence? That's the question our guest today set out to try and answer when he began his documentary film quest. Today we're talking to Jack Kelley, the director and narrator through the new film, The Atlantis Puzzle, an exploration that sets out to separate the fact from the fiction when it comes to this tantalizing topic. In this most excellent film, Jack highlights the work of the Greek researcher George Sarantitis, a Platonic scholar and engineer who has probably done more for the advancement of authentic Atlantean analysis than hundreds of years of establishment academics and screwball solipsists combined. Along with the linguistic and structural evidence that Sarantitis presents, the Atlantis Puzzle folds in the most up-to-date geological and archaeological sciences to paint a very different but much more believable range of possibilities to help us comprehend and differentiate the potential truth of Plato's Timaeus and Critias from the allegorical, dishonest, or downright incorrect aspects of these celebrated ancient texts. You can find the Atlantis Puzzle on Amazon and other streaming services, along with more of Jack's interviews and other filmmaking efforts at EmpireBuilderProductions.com. And all this will be linked in the show notes, so make sure you check out those links wherever you're listening to this for the many ways you can support InnerVerse too and get more out of me. And with all the introductions accomplished, let's do this thing. Everyone, welcome the Atlantean analyst and unlocker of the Platonic legacy, Jack Kelley. Thanks for coming on the show, man, and welcome to InnerVerse.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for that bold introduction.
Well, I first heard you on my favorite other podcast, Mysterious Universe, right? And that's where, of course, you get the stories of ancient Atlanteans procreating with dinosaurs, leading to their inevitable downfall, which is one of my favorite versions of the story. But
nothing good ever comes out of that. Yeah.
No. Stay away from the dinosaurs. But man, let's get to know you a little better. Before we got on the air, you were telling me some of your background and how your life inspired this type of, almost led you to this type of film and research. So tell us more about Jack Kelley.
Yeah, sure. I mean, a lot of people have heard different things about me before, but, the most common is, I studied classics at Yale as part of, my broader education. I was in a program there called the Directed Studies program, where you can, spend a lot of time digging into all the classical writers, right? So you kind of start out with the Iliad, you start out with Herodotus, you start out with Plato, and you work your way forward through time. But, what a lot of people probably haven't heard is, growing up as a young man, I was very immersed in the mythologies of not just kind of the Western world, but really all cultures. And my late father was a huge storyteller and reader of the myths of the world, and a big fan of Joseph Campbell. And so when I was a kid, there was nothing I enjoyed more than sitting around the fire and hearing a story from my dad, which I think is a wonderful way to ignite the imagination of a little kid rather than plunking them in front of a screen for hours at a time. So with that backdrop, same thing when it came to religion. My family was, my father's side of the family was Catholic, my mom's side was Protestant, and I never really was a very religiously oriented person. So I was about age 9. My mom wanted us all to go to church and so forth, and I really wasn't having it. So my dad said, look, you don't have to come to church and to, religious education classes with the rest of the family, but you can't just do nothing. So if you're not going to come, you have to sit here and you have to listen to an hour-long Joseph Campbell audio lecture, and you have to write me a paper about it. So I started out from a young age with, I think, a very different, a different exposure to the mythologies and religions of the world.
Wow, that's really exciting to kick off the conversation with that, because first of all, what you chose to do instead of going to Sunday school is actually quite a bit more intensive, but much more rewarding. And you saying that you have a background with Campbell, I mean, he coined the phrase monomyth, and that's kind of my favorite framework to look at all this stuff through, is to see what's the same and how really the Atlantis story contains the pieces of the monomyth, in my opinion, which, if you're aware of Campbell's work, makes me think maybe you kind of held back a little bit on the documentary itself and tried to keep it just in the realm of, sort of right in the middle for people to access more widely. But yeah, let's expand on that.
Yeah, I think, in terms of mythology, right, this is one of the biggest questions, or maybe the central question of the story chances. A lot of people are sort of out there saying, well, is this true or is it not true? And I think that that's the most simplistic layer, right? Within that, one of the things George Sarantitis, the researcher whose theories the film The Atlantis Puzzle follows, one of the things he talked about in his work on the methodology of mythology is, after spending a lot of time with Homer and Plato, he realized that, look, the myths that these ancient authors were constructing, they're obviously not all true, right? I mean, Zeus wasn't sitting there doing X, Y, and Z on a Thursday, right? And they're not all false either, because there are very true elements of things from the historical record, but also true is about human nature contained within them. And so in George's mind, the way these sort of myths were constructed was almost a bit puzzle-like, right? Like a kind of very complex interweaving of different strands. And the idea was not just to confuse you or baffle you, but for you to do the work as you matured of realizing, hey, I never noticed that before. Wait, what is he really saying there? Or what does this really mean? Is there some symbolism here I missed when I was younger hearing this story? And I think that's one of the other key elements I'll just throw out there, is that, as you can see by the books behind me, I mean, look, we live in a world where I think, what is it, like 100,000 books a year get published or something, some crazy number like that. And how many of those books do you think are going to be around in a couple hundred years? I mean, most of them, let's be honest, are probably not the best. But when we go back to the classical world, the Iliad and the Odyssey formed the core of ancient Greek education. Why was that? Was it because these guys were too lazy to write more stories? Well, no, it's because it's a little bit like the Bible, in the sense of, hey, there's a lot packed in there. You can pull a lot of different things out of this depending on your level of reading, and you can read the same story over and over again, and you can pull new things out of it each time.
It's on the level of religious scriptures in that sense, multi-leveled allegory, several different allegories going on at the same time. And just like people's kind of dogmatic reading of, say, the Bible, they're really missing out on a great deal of the wisdom the text has to offer if they try to just keep it in the framework of pure historicity. But I do, on that subject, before we go further, because I definitely want to talk more about that methodology of mythology that George has going on, and more about George himself. He seems like quite a character. But for the people that maybe aren't as familiar with the Timaeus or the Critias, and have heard everything under the sun about Atlantis, the whole gamut, like I described in the introduction, can you help us by laying out what's actually there? Where does this actually come from? And how is that different than what is popularly described all over the net?
Right. And this is one of the things we try and do in the Atlantis Puzzle documentary, is try to explain how there's sort of a wave of pop culture that embraced Atlantis basically in the last 120 years, and how a lot of that imagery that we have has come out of what you could loosely term kind of science fiction-y versions of this story, and people with kind of free energy crystals and flying cars, kind of talking porpoise men and with laser guns and stuff like that. None of which I might add is contained in the original story. So you might say, well, how can we sift back through all this and get back to what the story was originally about? And luckily enough for us, the story originates with a specific person at a specific place in a specific time. It's not lost in the mists of prehistory, and that individual's the Greek philosopher Plato, who lived roughly, I'm going to say around like 428 to 348 BCE in Athens, Greece. And for a lot of people have heard Plato's name, but basically Plato was like the foundational thinker and philosopher of the Western world. And there are people who preceded him, like the famous Socrates, who was Plato's teacher. The thing about Socrates is that he never wrote anything. And many of the other early philosophers, let's call them, of preceding or contemporary with Socrates, we only really have a few fragments of things that they wrote. So this is why Plato is such an important figure, is that we have dozens of his books, right? And among those books are two. One's called Timaeus, one's called Critias. And within the Timaeus and the Critias is contained the Atlantis story. And the thing that's a little bit remarkable about this, and I think most people don't realize, is that those books aren't completely about Atlantis, right? So the story sets off. And Plato wrote what we call dialogues. A lot of people probably heard, Platonic dialogues. Well, what does that mean? Well, most of his books were set up in the dramatic format of a discussion among two or more people, right? So, and the way they're often written is, Chance says, why, yes, Socrates, what is the good? And then Socrates says, well, Chance, if the good is this, then what do we think this is, right? So there's this sort of exchange and conversational flow of discussion.
Which automatically constitutes at least a degree of fiction, because nobody can just remember exactly what they said to somebody else in a long conversation.
100%. And in fact, Plato points this very subject, that very fact out indirectly in a couple different dialogues, one of which springs to mind is Theaetetus, where, a story is being told, and he said, and it's a couple guys talking, and one of them says, well, I heard this story from this guy, and he heard it from Socrates, and Socrates was telling him a story about a conversation he'd had like 30 years earlier. So right there, you have several degrees of being removed. And this is true in Timaeus and Critias as well. So the dramatic situation is you got Socrates, right? This philosopher of the streets, kind of, irascible character. And he is having conversation with three guys, Timaeus, Critias, and another guy named Hermocrates, who doesn't get mentioned very often. So there's four guys sitting there hanging out, having a chat in Athens about philosophy and ideas. And what they sort of say is, look, Socrates, and then again, this is a dramatic setup. Yesterday, you gave us such a great speech, and it was all about the ideal city-state. And we thought that was so great that we'd like to pay you back. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to give speeches. What would you like us to talk about? And Socrates says, well, I'd like you guys to talk a little bit about the ideal city and how that might function in the world in contest with other cities, or, just in general. And so Timaeus is the first guy to give a speech. He then gives this like long philosophical speech, and he says, well, before we kind of get into this, I got to give all this philosophical background. Now, just before he starts, Critias pipes up and says, well, before Timaeus, you start, I got something to say, which is, Socrates, your story about the ideal city-state reminded me almost exactly of a story I heard when I was a kid from my grandfather, whose name was also Critias. And he heard that story from his dad, and he heard it from Solon, who was one of the seven sages, and he was a real person. He was around circa 600 BCE, right? So we're going back a few generations. And he says that story was basically about an ideal city-state, which was we'll call it prehistoric proto-Athens, because we know today that the city of Athens did not exist in the same form as 9600 BC, and a competition, basically a war between that Athens and this evil empire called Atlantis. And I'm going to tell you guys the stories. But first, Timaeus, you tell your speech. So that's Timaeus. And Timaeus goes on this long philosophical discussion. Boom. Next story, next book is called Critias. And this is where Critias himself now gives his speech. And he says, guys, remember I told you I was going to tell you this story about this great war between the Athens of 9600 BC and, the evil Atlantean Empire. Well, here it goes. Now I'm going to tell it to you. And the mysterious thing about Critias is that after you get about, in the equivalent of the modern book, maybe 20 pages in, it just stops. It just cuts off mid-sentence with no explanation. Like there's no notes, there's no manuscript that Plato wrote, I'll come back to this later, or, had to go get lunch. Sorry, So that's the backdrop of this story, which kind of describes this ancient war between these two different powers.
So there's so many clues with what you just laid out that I want to point to in terms of that monomyth with beginning talking about Joseph Campbell. When I talk about the monomyth, I mean, like, there's one real core mythology that seems to permeate through all of the ancient mythologies of the world, where because of a lack of symbolic literacy or just a lack of knowledge of multiple sets of stories, people don't necessarily realize that, hey, we might be looking at actually a common origin for these stories. Maybe some kind of cultural diffusion. A little more far-fetched is that maybe they're actually true, but each area claims the events as their own. We do know that the Greeks were fond of that type of mythological imperialism, actually. And so, for example, Solon, he's one of the seven sages, and he is seemingly a real individual. But when you compare to, say, the seven, they're called the Apkallu of Babylon. They're seven kings or sages or wise men that lived before the flood, who taught all of the arts of civilization. You have the seven rishis of India, who are said to be descended from Menu, and Menu is basically like the Adam and the Noah figure. And you have, when you talk about Noah, actually, because this story is all about the deluge, right? When you talk about Noah, he's got seven individuals who are on the ark with him that survive. So this, like, flood hero or first man comes along with seven other people or seven aspects, or he's eight aspects. And that's very common throughout the various mythological frameworks of the world. And where it gets lost is, like, maybe whenever he's represented as Shiva or something, it's actually that he's got like eight elemental forms or something rather than being eight different beings. But that pattern is there. Even going to like Hermopolis in ancient Egypt, there's an inscription that's attributed to Hermes about, I am one that becomes two, two that becomes four, four that becomes eight. After that, I am one again. You even see it in the Bagawa symbol all the way over in China. So there's lots of like fingerprints to this idea where the further you kind of pull on the thread, you find that basically all the cosmogonies of mythology and legend are flood stories. And all of the flood stories are actually creation stories. And so this is what I think is going on possibly with Timaeus, is like, why in the same story do you get the same dialogue, you get the story of Atlantis, this war and this sunken continent, at the same time alongside a cosmogony of the demiurge bringing order to the chaotic matter of the cosmos to bring forth a world that we can recognize. Like, I think the biggest clue is that those are in the same story. Those are in the same dialogue.
Yeah. So Chance, you mean you've just opened several maybe Pandora's boxes here, but certainly if you look at ancient mythologies of that we're familiar with everywhere from Egypt to India, there are these concepts of either trinities or symmetries. And like the Ogdoad, right, is the Egyptian set of gods, but there's also sets of 4 gods, but in some versions it's 5, right? So there's different numbers. And in the Atlantis story, Poseidon allegedly, mates with a mortal woman, and they have 5 sets of twins. So you have 10. First of all, the twinning, there's something there, right? The idea of double or separation, a twin story. And then you have 10. What does that mean? And you play the other thing.
Sometimes those 7 sages are 10 sages. That does happen.
Yeah. So there's different there, and certainly if you go into some later, schools of esotericism and numerical symbolism, there's different groups that have different ideologies about number, right? And I mean, that there is symbolic meaning to specific numbers. And I think some of that may have originated in Egypt and been brought to Greece through the Pythagorean school, because Pythagoras, of course, famously studied in Egypt. And I think, the relationship, the other interesting thing here that most people forget is that, as you pointed out, Solon allegedly heard this story. And we always say 600 BC, but it was probably around 594 or 593, because that's when he left Athens after he kind of reconstructed their government. And he went on this trip to Egypt, where he went to the Temple of Sais and allegedly had this conversation, right, where he hears the Atlantis story. And, the Greeks viewed Egypt as kind of the most ancient place around, right? And that they knew that their civilization had gone back for thousands of years. And you see specific references to that. So the fact that Plato himself is known to have visited Egypt and studied there, and figures like Pythagoras and Solon have visited and presumably done some study there, well, it tells you that there was an exchange between these two cultures. So I don't think it's odd that we might see some cross-pollination.
Yeah, and to me, that's where the fun is to look for the cross-pollination. Can't help but point out also that with these like lawgiver, civilization starter type figures, Saturnian or Kronos type figures, that they're associated with the sun as well. And that Solon, his name is Sol and On. Both of those are names of the sun just put together. And in fact, Kronos and Saturn are both the sun before they get attributed to the planet that is the farthest one away that we can see with the naked eye. And another cool clue, I brought up Menu from the Hindu mythology. There's definitely crossover with Hinduism, Buddhism, all the way over to Greece. Plenty of evidence for that. But the part of Critias or of Timaeus, where it's at the very beginning, there's a description of the different castes in Athenian society, and how it's maybe it depends on how you interpret it translation wise, but in many translations it appears that it's being said that the people's placement in their caste has something to do with an intrinsic quality, a hidden quality of their soul. And that is 100% in the ordinances of Menu, the Hindu cosmogony that was first brought forward by Sir William Jones in the early 19th century, along with a bunch of these other aspects I'm talking about. And that name Menu, I mean, it goes all over the place. There's Minos of Crete. He's a lawgiver. There's a version of it. I maybe can't exactly remember what the name is, but there's an Egyptian version of Menu. There's the Norse have Manus. So there's all these lawgivers, and I think Solon might be a type of that, because his contributions to Athenian society, they kick off a golden age. And that's always what's said of Kronos, is that the golden age of Kronos. I think it's because part of this monomyth, the seed, and I mean quite literally seed, because that's what KRN actually means, corn, seed, take the vowels out of Kronos. The seed is that at each at certain intervals, the world, whether either at large or in a regional sense, is destroyed and regenerated, and the first man reincarnates, who is also actually the god or the son of God, reincarnates and then rebuilds society, reestablishes society from a more pure place. And then humanity degrades, devolves, and has to be destroyed again because of their wickedness. And it all happens again. In some accounts, it's actually the same exact things happen identically or so similarly that it's, in parallel. So again, I think that we see that so much in Greek mythology. I mean, the legend of Troy is the same deal. Troy means three. The mythical founder of Troy is a guy named Tros or Choice, like Tros, which is, toi. That's a word for three. And he has three sons, just like Noah or Adam. And his, one of his sons is actually named Ilus, which is one of the Phoenician titles for Kronos. And so I could go on and on. This is like my favorite thing, though. I've been searching for what is the monomyth itself, and I think it's this destruction and regeneration, whether it's an ark or a cosmic egg or what have you. There's versions of it, and once you know what symbols interchange with each other, you start to find the fingerprints of it in all kinds of stories, where it might not be about a worldwide destruction. It might be about just one place, like say Sodom and Gomorrah being destroyed, but that conflagration of fire of Sodom and Gomorrah leads Lot to have to go into a cave, the cave of Brahm, and copulate with his daughters in order to, from their perspective, repopulate the human race that they think has been annihilated. So Lot becomes the great father archetype right there. And so once you know to look for that, it's like a bunch of stories that you might not have realized were basically a cosmogony allegory start to emerge as such, and it starts to make some sense of things.
Well, I think what you pointed out here, if I were to identify one thread, it's that there are multiple layers within these stories, and that we find these stories throughout different branches of humanity at different times as well, right? I mean, there's some of these stories are older or younger, and I think if you look at a figure like Plato, right, who again was, hanging around circa, 400 BC in Athens, and he's exposed to the myths of at least two other major cultures, right, the Egyptians and the Phoenicians in the form of the Carthaginians, right, because the Phoenicians had founded Carthage. So, and the Phoenicians were a Semitic people. So you have kind of two different threads at a minimum. And then, of course, there's whatever cultural stories or things may have come from exposure to the Persian Empire, which, of course, in turn extended all the way to India and so forth, right? So the idea that you have to ask yourself when you're looking at this myth is from a variety of perspectives. But one of the things that's certainly clear is that a figure like Plato was not a dope, and that he would have cleverly played with the names or the figures or the chronology, and this is one of the most fascinating things, Chance, that I found in doing research for the Atlantis Puzzle documentary is that, my first thought was, well, I got to fact check George Sarantitis' work. Like, how much of this stuff could have been true? How much was false? And we go to some lengths about that in the documentary, right? But then, as I've continued to think about it, and the film is obviously now out, streaming and so forth all over the world, and everybody's seeing it, but I didn't stop when the film stopped, right? I've continued to go back and reread these dialogues, and I actually went back and reread about half of Plato's books. And what I can tell you is that the subjects or themes that are contained in the Atlantis story didn't just pop out one day. It's not like Plato was just eating breakfast one day and he said, "Oh, sorry, I don't know how I created this little thumbs up here." I don't think he was eating breakfast one day and just thought, you know what? I feel like writing a book called Timaeus. It'll be about all this stuff. Well, when you look back at his other books, and specifically, I was just looking at the Phaedrus, and then there's another one, I think it's called the Menexenus, elements on the Atlantis story and the Timaeus and the Critias are present in those earlier dialogues, right? And in fact, he may have written Menexenus kind of between writing the first book of his Republic and books 2 through 10. So I think what this shows is that Plato was thinking about these ideas of the rise and fall of civilization and the relationship of the individual's journey toward wisdom and the structure of society, right? For a long time, probably for his whole life. And one of the things, Chance, I'd like to say, if people are like, that sounds kind of boring, I'm like, well, you have to ask yourself today, what are the important questions? Well, aren't the same questions being asked for us today? How much personal liberty should people have? How should you spend your time? What's a good education consist of? And what's the proper role of government? And how does the government affect the quality of life of its citizens and their personal development, right? So, these were all questions that were being asked back in that time. And if you look deep within the Atlantis story, what I've found, or what I believe is there, is an incredibly profound examination of human nature, the nature of conflict, the nature of societies, the rise and fall of civilizations. And I think that Plato's doing this not with just some stuff he pulled out of his back pocket, but as you said, he's referencing a mythological tradition that preceded him and to which he had access.
I love that you have this depth of fascination and familiarity with the ancient authors and the Platonic works, probably more so than me when it comes to Plato himself. And that's exciting because I think I'm going to learn a lot as we continue this conversation. And I almost, like, as great as the documentary was, again, it's almost that you kind of shoot for the middle with that, because people are going to want to know just like what's the nuts and bolts proof of all this. And it is quite an interesting journey to chase down the theories that George came up with. And I think we should talk about that some. But I just love that you've got the mind of a philosopher, because you're pointing out something super important that I'll just expand on briefly, that why would someone as obviously wise and important as Plato spend all this time talking about cosmogony, talking about civilizations destroyed and things of that nature? Same goes for Homer. Why is the Iliad the foundational myth of all of the ancient Greeks? Because maybe there's an idea underlying it all that to have a properly functioning society, to have an ideal and healthy and best possible life for everybody, that things should be structured to mirror what they were in humanity's origin as closely as possible. And to do that, then, well, we need to investigate what were the conditions of our origin, right? I mean, we see that the profound sickness or dysfunction in our world today seems to accelerate the further we get away from the natural way of doing things, our natural state. And I'm sure that the ancient Greek sages were no less observant than we are in how those things correspond to one another. And so, of course, it becomes really important that if we want to access the most incredibly mysterious but powerful part of being a human, which is that thing that connects us to the divine, our generative power, both in a procreative sense, but also in a just general imagination access sense, then yeah, we probably need to keep asking the question of where do we come from? How did we get here? Keep pulling on that thread for the benefits that may not be like obvious at first, but that I'm sure you can relate to in your life, asking those big questions, investigating that generative mystery leads you to a better life whether or not you can kind of put a 1-to-1, like this is how it made my life better, but it has, it's made you a better person. So it is actually a very valuable and important investigation, even if to a non-philosophical type, it might seem like academic, runaround.
Absolutely. And I think one of the tragedies of the Atlantis story and the Timaeus and Critias is that they're not as widely studied as Plato's books like The Republic or The Apology or, stuff like that. And honestly, after the continued research and reading I've been doing, I think the Timaeus and Critias, which includes the Atlantis story, is one of the greatest works, not only of Plato's, like totally kind of ignored and not given the credit it's due, but it's maybe one of the greatest, those two books together, if you attack on the Republic, one of the greatest works in the history of human thought. I mean, it pulls on so many threads, drawing from just straight up history, right? Like what was going on in Plato's world at the time in the Greek city-states. I mean, that's one layer. Going back to mythological origins and stories of the gods and asking questions about that, that's another layer. But then, deeper layers about, what does it mean? What is the proper role of human being? And then, of course, you have to ask the question, well, what's the proper role of society and how the society and the individual interact? And I think one of the tragedies is that the academic interpretation of this has always been, and if you Google this, there is some dispute, right? Not everybody agrees exactly, but the general gist is people often say, well, Critias was never finished. Plato dropped it because, he wasn't really content with where the story was going. And then he decided to start writing his last book, which was the last book he ever wrote, called The Laws. And so that just sort of suggests that, after I got through reading, at first I thought, well, maybe that's true. And then by the time I was done researching and making this film over the course of 3 or 4 years, I thought, you fools. Of course, Plato didn't just do this while you think he was writing it one day and he just got tired and decided to take a nap and he never picked it back up. Is the type of guy who seems like he didn't finish shit that he started, right? Certainly not the case. So the other danger I'll point out, and I think most of academia fell prey to this, is that they said, well, this is just sort of an allegory about the Atlanteans behave badly, right? They're attacking their neighbors and they're taking people over. They're being aggressive. And therefore the gods punish them, right? That's a simplistic view, and that's generally what's propounded. I will point out there are some standard academic thinkers who do go deeper, and they sort of, they do read it. So I don't want it to say that all of academia are morons who did not pick this up, because some of them have. Right, some of them see there's a lot going on here, but I don't think anybody ever put all the pieces together until George Sarantitis.
Yeah, I think this would be a great time to talk a little bit more about how he did that, the methodology of mythology, and the trail that, maybe to entice people to check out your documentary, the trail that sent you on. And also would love it if we could talk, maybe we'll save this for after you talk more about meeting George, what got you interested in George and what he's actually proposing. But that cliffhanger ending to Critias is something I had never thought about before your documentary, and the conclusion that George initiates you into about that ending is, I think, rather compelling and worth talking more about. So we'll get there, but George himself, I want to know more about what it's like to be around that guy. He seems super fun.
George Sarantitis is a wonderful human being and a real multidisciplinary kind of Renaissance man thinker, right? And I've talked about this before, but I totally stumbled on George's work by accident. My wife and I were on vacation on a Greek island, and there happened to be a book that had a couple of his writings contained in it, along with some other stuff, in a hotel. And I just started reading this book by the pool, and I stumbled on George. Never heard about George before. boom, I said, I just was shocked because I thought this guy's read on the Atlantis story is so profound, both from a philosophical standpoint, but also from a practical standpoint in terms of pointing out where this place might actually have been, and that it wasn't just a fantasy. And that either, he sort of says, well, look, either the story is all just nonsense, right? Which he doesn't believe and I don't believe, or it's woven out of truth and falsehood and you have to put it together. And so the question he kind of asked in his papers was like, look, why are there such detailed descriptions of the geography and the geometry, for example, of the Atlantean capital city? Did Plato's students need a geometry lesson in the middle of this story, right? I mean, Aristotle didn't know how to circumscribe a circle. Like, I don't think that's the case. So Plato is a frequent user of geometry, and there's a saying that geometry, or what was the saying? Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here, was carved over the door of Plato's academy. So clearly mathematical geometric thinking was important. And you find this sprinkled throughout a lot of Plato's work. So anyway, when I read that George was addressing some of these subjects, I thought, okay, here's a guy who's really sinking his teeth into the meat of this. He's not just another guy who's like, well, did you know that, elephants once lived in Spain and therefore Spain is where Atlantis is? That's my thesis. This was a guy who was going back. And for those who don't know, Sarantitis became so fascinated by Plato's use of mythology that he wrote some papers, one of which is called The Methodology of Mythology, where he really tried to dig into, okay, what's a myth? Like he had read a lot, he knew the Homeric myths and everything, but what makes Plato's myths different, right? How are they the same as Homeric mythic structure, and how might they be different? And if so, why is that? What are these? What's the purpose of writing a myth? Like, why would Plato incorporate myths into his stories? Because I don't know about where you went to high school, Chance, but where I went to high school, like my physics teacher wasn't incorporating mythology into, my physics class, or my geometry class. So what was the value of myth as a teaching tool, right? Because if you think about it, who is Plato writing these books for? He's writing them for his students or for his contemporaries, right? He was not thinking, I'm going to deposit this in a time capsule. One day, Chance and Jack are going to get a chance to read this stuff. He's thinking, okay, I'm writing this so Aristotle and these other guys can break their minds trying to figure this stuff out. So the thing that Sarantitis kind of identified was, he said, look, these myths have value as a teaching tool, which means that there's something you're supposed to get out of them. They're not just, in other words, they're not just here for entertainment value, right? So if you think about it from that, once you start thinking about these myths from that light, now you have a responsibility, right? Because if it's just a fairy tale, you don't have to do much thinking, right? Like, of course, there can be, not to say there can't be deep elements within fairy tales and so forth, but if it's just a nonsense story, you don't have to do too much mental work, right? Conversely, if it's a news report that's like, this has all been fact checked, stamped, approved, peer reviewed, we think this is all correct. Well, then that's sort of saying, look, this is all the truth. But if the story is neither all true nor all false, now you, as the reader, the responsibility shifts to you. You have to go do the work to figure out which parts of this might be true and which parts might be false. And that was sort of the crux of Sarantitis's approach.
I think that reflects the philosophy of mystery school and wisdom traditions from time immemorial all the way up to modern Freemasonry, where wisdom is just not valuable to the pearls cast before swine. You know what I mean? Like, there's a certain strange metaphysical nature of truth that, on one hand, it's always present, it's always in front of you. You can't ever be separate from truth or capital R reality. Yet On the other hand, it's only there for the person who asks for it, who asks the question. And if you're kind of in your own preconceived notions and hyper reality filtration systems, especially today with all the media that offers a reality worldview that makes nature itself seem less real than real, well, it's no surprise that the most popular hot take on Plato is this kind of pop culture fake Gnosticism that tries to assert that the demiurge is an evil figure and that the God is the God that we hear about in the Bible, for example, is actually the devil, and that the reality is a prison in a cage. Where, I don't think that that's a proper interpretation of Plato, in my opinion. It's pretty clear, especially in Timaeus, that the demiurge's intention for the creation of the world is to increase good. That's what the ordering of it was about. I mean, demiurgos, it means, demotic of the people, ergos, worker. He works for us. And that's kind of the point of a deity, is that, and of an artist, a parent, you work for your children. It's consistent with the microcosm in every way, but that's not the popular interpretation anymore at this point. And it's not really supported by your observations of reality, but it is very, pop culturally consistent to things like the Matrix and all that. And again, I think that's back to the point of why I opened up this thread, is like, the truth is something you have to ask for. You have to seek it out. And the strange metaphysical property of truth is that when you ask for it, when you look for it, it comes and finds you. So why I segue this is to exactly what happened with George in his quest to understand why this geometry, why this geography, why is Plato giving us such specific details? Can you talk a little bit about where that what might have seemed like a wild goose chase led him to some pretty fantastic parts of the world?
Yeah, and this is kind of the heart of a big chunk of the Atlantis Puzzle documentary, where we kind of explore George's ideas. Was one of the things I love about George Sarantitis, who's a guy of great humor and great learning, and again, polymath kind of guy who's well read in innumerable subjects, is George took Plato seriously, and he refused to consider that this whole story was sort of nonsense or just a kind of a dry academic, isn't this interesting, and how does this compare with Aristotle and so forth, blah blah blah. I mean, I think we rob a little bit, to your point, we rob the mystery and the magic and the excitement of writers like Plato from students with this very dry, I hate to say boring approach. And again, I've had some wonderful teachers, so I don't want to say that this is everywhere or this is every school or this is it. So please don't mistake what I'm saying. But generally speaking, how many kids like going to school? I mean, it's just you're taught stuff in such a dry, boring way. And so if you have to work for something for yourself, you change. Again, your role changes. I think about, when I was in like high school history class and your teacher is kind of lecturing to you or telling you, okay, and this is what happened in World War II and blah, 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 blah. And then this happened. And does anybody know how many ships the Japanese Navy had? Raise your hand. And you're just like, Jesus, this is awful. But if you flipped it around and said, okay, here's a dispatch from the Pacific in 1944. What do you make of this? Well, now all of a sudden, you can't just be sitting there like a slug drooling. You have to get into it. So I think George saw this and he decided, I'm going to approach this as Plato intended, right? I'm going to use his own words, and I'm going to use what was known at that point in time about geography and history and so forth. to uncover what's really going on in the story. And to make a very long story short, what Sarantitis realized about Atlantis was that, and this is one of the most baffling things about this whole story, is that essentially within the books, it sort of says, look, to get to Atlantis, presumably from Greece, you have to cross a body of water that was called the Atlantic Pelagos. And then there's other bodies of water in Atlantic Pontos, and maybe there's a Thalassa and some other things. And then you kind of eventually, by sailing through these different realms, you're going to wind up at the Atlantean capital city. Right.
Let me make that a key point too, that your documentary expands on greatly, but the the difference between the pop culture Atlantis and the Platonic Atlantis is that there's never the use of the word Okeanos. It's Pelagos, which is an inland water. So the whole search for Atlantis as a sunken continent somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean was never indicated by the text at all at any point. Huge. That's huge.
100%. I mean, that's kind of the punchline that Sarantitis realized was, well, wait a minute. First of all, Plato uses the word Okeanos in other books that he wrote. So it's not like he didn't know what that word meant. And then second of all, the other thing I realized as I was doing the research for this, and George figured this out as well, is that ancient people knew about the Atlantic Ocean. There was this sort of weird academic idea. Well, maybe they didn't know what the Atlantic Ocean was, and that's where the Pillars of Heracles were. And, they didn't think you could go beyond that and all this other stuff. Again,
Phoenicians were bringing tin all over the ancient world, which means they were visiting Britain, which means they were well aware.
Yep. Hey, I think there were two guys. What I think their names were, was Himilco, and then there was, what was the other guy's name? So-and-so, the navigator. I forget his name, Hamilcar or something like that. Two Carthaginians who had sailed north, as you said, to for tin, and then south along the coast of Africa. So basically, this idea that Atlantis was somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, which was popularized, by the way, by like Victorian-era researchers like Ignatius Donnelly, right? And that was based on a misreading. And I think, Chance, this is one of the best lessons we could take on a more mundane level, is that these translators didn't know what an Atlantic Pelagos was. They're like, well, I never heard of an Atlantic Pelagos. Have you, Theodosius? No, I haven't. How about you? And so they assumed, well, he must have meant the Atlantic Ocean, because we know what the Atlantic Ocean is, but none of us have ever heard of an Atlantic Pelagos. It's not in any of the other ancient sources. So I guess that's what he meant. But as George came to realize, this meant that you had to cross a body of water that was probably more like the Aegean Sea, or maybe the Adriatic, right? Like something mostly enclosed by land. And for again, you can watch the film to get all the details, but the other key question was the Pillars of Heracles, because supposedly the mouth of this Atlantic Pelagos was kind of bookended by the Pillars of Heracles. Well, that had, most sort of, I'll say, Victorian era and kind of 20th century scholars talking about, well, this had to be referencing the Atlantic Ocean, because that's where the Pillars of Heracles are in Gibraltar, right? That's where they are today. But as Sarantitis realized, going back and reading other ancient sources place the Pillars of Heracles all over in different places. And this here I go with the thumbs up. I don't know how this is doing, So maybe it's the cosmos telling me I got a good idea.
Definitely.
So the idea that the Pillars of Heracles, well, of course they expanded, because what did they represent, right? They weren't, that there was dispute among ancient authors. Some guys thought that they were mountains. Some guys thought they were islands. Other guys thought that they were actual physical columns, like physical pillars. But they all kind of, by the era of Plato and Herodotus, who was the father of history and preceded Plato by a generation or so, everybody kind of agreed that they were somewhere in the, modern Gibraltar. But they couldn't agree on exactly where or what they were. Well, what's that tell you, Chance? It tells you that nobody actually knew what they were talking about. And essentially what Sarantitis realized was that this process of the Pillars of Heracles representing something like a boundary marker had continued to expand as Greek seafaring had expanded throughout ancient history, right? So there are records of the pillars being attributed to what's that strait between Sicily and Italy? I forget what it's called. There's other people attributed it to like the Black Sea, like kind of the passage that goes from the Aegean to the Black Sea, and other people attribute it to even I think Tacitus talks about much later in the Roman era that some people claim there were pillars all the way up. I think of like the where the Rhine empties into like the North Sea. So these pillars, and the other thing Sarantitis did that I love was he wasn't just guessing about this stuff, and he wasn't using translations even into modern Greek. He went back to the original ancient Greek. So he looked real hard at Plato's original words. And the word that Plato uses for the pillars has a double meaning. And that word is, in English, we'd say, stellae, right? A stele or a stella. And that sort of could either mean a physical column, but it could also mean, and its more common usage was, as like a historical marker. Like, when you're out driving and you pull over for lunch and you see a plaque in a park somewhere and it says, so-and-so had the battle of such and such in the Civil War here, and it's a little plaque. Well, the Greeks were in the habit of leaving these plaques kind of at the boundaries of their exploration. So again, to make a very long story short, Sarantitis realized that in Plato's story, the pillars he's referencing were not the identification of the pillars at the Strait of Gibraltar. They had to be someplace else. And with that, coupled with, this is where the kind of the trick comes in, because George had an aid that the ancient people wouldn't have had unless they had been to these locations themselves or knew somebody who had been there and observed them firsthand, right? So George had modern climate science. So one of the subjects we talk about is the Green Sahara. And for those who haven't seen the film, kind of the punchline is that essentially the lands of Atlantis, as described, seem to refer to what today is northwestern Africa. And if that seems a little bit, exciting or not exciting, or just another theory, well, George's theory is firmly grounded in Plato's exact original words. So the idea is that there were these megalakes that existed during a period called the Green Sahara. And this was sort of in the early Holocene. And this is not a controversial scientific thing. This is well known today. And this climate science has advanced a lot in the last 20 years. So essentially, George figured out, okay, if you look at the geometry and the map of Atlantis, this pretty much matches up with northwestern Africa, which makes a hell of a lot of sense for a variety of reasons, not least of which we can get to down the road here.
Well, yeah, you just laid out a lot of clues there. The Atlas Mountains being in that northwestern part of Africa does kind of solve the mystery of why it might have been called Atlantis in the first place, or why there's an Atlantic Pelagos. And the other part about the Pillars of Hercules that is worth considering is the astrotheological allegory of that terminology. That are you very familiar with that concept, astrotheology?
No, tell me a little bit about it.
Well, one of the fun layers of myth and scripture that is absolutely there once you start looking for it is that it is allegorized by the constellations and the path of the sun through the ecliptic. Or you could say it's actually the reverse, that the mythology is allegorical to the zodiac itself. So yeah, where does
I'm familiar with some of that stuff, particularly some kind of, archaeoastronomy stuff, which is, I think, highly relevant in Egyptian myth for sure.
It tends to be relevant to all of it once you know the patterns. And like, how many labors did Hercules have?
12. Well, he originally had 10 and then 2 got tacked on, right? So
yes, but there's evidence that the ancient zodiac might have been 10 before it was 12 too, or 9. So again, there's that shifting number. Is it 7? Is it 8? Is it 10? Is it 12? Sure. But when we see the fact that it does become 12, it makes you think, okay, this is an update. This is an updated version. So it's possible. Do you remember what else was involved with Hercules' labor in which the pillars were described?
Well, as far as I recall, Hercules had to go on a series of adventures, and I've been to some of these places, right? He had to kill the Stymphalian birds. There was the the giant boar he had to kill. There was the Nemean lion, right? He had to cleanse the Aegean stables. There was another guy he had to wrestle, who he had to hold him up in the air instead of slamming him down. I don't remember what the other ones were, to be frank. So, no, what was the other reference there to the pillars?
That's why I'm asking, because I can't remember off the top of my head which labor the pillars might correspond to. I
don't think actually, Chance, that they're specifically mentioned in kind of that mythology. I think they came to be viewed as Hercules was a sort of, and Heracles and Hercules are the same guy,
right,
just the Greco-Roman spelling. But Heracles was sort of this hero who you'll probably recall was with the Argonauts, who sailed all over, right? And Jason and the Argonauts, right? Hercules was a member of the crew of that ship, right? So there's another set of mythology where you have,
and it's also taken us right back to that world age doctrine that I started off talking about. Because what's the third letter of the Greek alphabet? Gamma. But that G sound interchangeable with the C sound, which is why our third letter in the alphabet in English is C. So philologically speaking, Argo is ark. It's the same word. And it's a big boat that a hero goes on a journey for, that is about, like, sort of a regenerative journey. It's a bit of like a civilizational cosmogony in a way, is a foundational myth. So like, even all the way in India, they have the same thing. They call it Arga. So there's some more cultural diffusion for you there. But yeah,
or there may be some roots in kind of Indo-European languages just sort of having common threads, which I think is a pretty well established
exactly. But when you have those fun philological tricks where letter interchangeability, that gives you a much easier way to comprehend languages. Like, I don't speak Greek, but I know the alphabet, and I know what letters become other letters from language to language. So sometimes I can interpret a word and know what it means without needing to look it up, because it's actually the same word. And argo is one of those words.
Yeah, well, so I think, long story short, there is, for people who don't know, right? Heracles and these other heroes are sort of sailing all around, exploring, doing various deeds of heroism and so forth, right? And this idea was that these guys were sort of exploring the bounds of the known world, right? They had gone as far as any Greek had ever gone, right? So that kind of dovetails back to this idea of the Pillars of Heracles, and that these were sort of these markers, right? And it's pillar in English is just sort of the wrong word. It should really be something more like commemorative plaque, right? Is how we should really be translating that. And that those markers, represented the bounds of the known world. And clearly that expands over time, right? I mean, people over hundreds and hundreds of years of Greek seafaring, right? They continue to expand until the point in time of Herodotus and Plato, where the pillars kind of had come to mean the Strait of Gibraltar. Why? There was no further place to go, right? That was sort of the last place where you could have an aperture out into the ocean, where you could have two sides that you had to pass through. So you sort of say, well, we can't push that boundary any farther. I guess that's where it is, right? So just to circle back to thread the needle on that one.
And if Hercules represents one element of what that story represents is the sun traveling through the ecliptic, then one meaning of the Pillars of Hercules could be the solstices or the equinoxes, one of those points that could have demarcated the close of one year and the beginning of a new year, because that's something that pillars represent too, is like a gate. So the gates of the year, which is very important to a lot of solar deities, or say like a Janus figure. So that's a possibility too, another layer that I like to entertain. And this, you know what? Oh yeah, we got to get to talking about what George actually found when he went and checked out Northwest Africa. You know, once he kind of determined that maybe that Atlantean Pelagos was referring to this green Sahara, high levels of water, old early Holocene, very different view of place like Nigeria or Mauritania. Yeah.
So just to kind of go back to that part of the story, and again, we go into great depth about this in the film. Sarantitis had a real explorer mindset, and so he sort of, it reminds me a little bit of I studied Greek history with a professor named Donald Kagan at Yale, who used to say that he had what he called a high naivete, which meant that he believed the ancient sources unless whatever they were saying was impossible, or he had good facts to refute them. And I think this was a little bit of the attitude George had, was he sort of said, well, look, he's saying there's a place and that there's a way to get to it. And he's giving some very specific directional orientations, and there's clues within the grammar about, which direction you have to head in relationship to what, and am I here or am I there? So he kind of pieced this all together between the two books. And by the way, it's slightly different in Timaeus and Critias, which is almost akin to a perspective shift, right? In Timaeus, it's sort of that place over there. And then when you're in the Critias story, which is about Atlantis, more specifically, you're sort of there, right? And it becomes that there in Greek, it's, that there plain or that there sea, distant, becomes the pan-Pelagos or the pan-plane. So George realized these are the there Pelagos in Timaeus and the pan-Pelagos in Critias is the same place. So there's a perspective shift, right? So this is another hint by Plato, and this is why I love this. There's so many damn levels to this, right? About what's the Atlantean society like? It starts with a god. They're all descended from Poseidon and a human woman. They go back. It's exactly what you said, isn't it? And they descend down through the ages. And what happens? What does it say in Critias? Well, the farther along they get over thousands of years or whatever period of time, their divine DNA becomes diluted and they become more and more corrupt. You see what I'm saying? They go from the divine to something more approaching the human. And that's when they get greedy. And that's even though they're blessed and they have all these riches and good stuff going on. And then what do? They start attacking other people. They get greedy. They want to go conquest. They want to create empire. Who are the Proto-Athenians? It's referenced back to Plato's Republic, the idealized intellectual city-state. So the Atlanteans are the perfect traditional mytho-religious historical city-state. The Proto-Athenians in the Atlantis story are like that's basically the society of Plato's Republic, a society created in the mind. But as you pointed out, the society in the Republic was supposed to be created to create the most just society of all time. But in order to create justice, it seems like you have to create a lot of weird injustice along the way. Do the means justify the end? Now, what is Plato doing? He's pitting the traditional world. I don't know what the heck just happened.
Oh my gosh, you're really onto something, man. I've seen the thumbs up before. I've never seen fireworks, but this is the grand finale. This is some grand finale.
The two societies are coming into conflict in this war. And that's exactly what Socrates asked Timaeus and Critias to tell him a story about. And I'm going to let other people draw their conclusions from that. But you're going to find, if you say, well, wait a minute, why Plato made this story up? Why he could have set the story anywhere? Why did he set it in Northwest Africa? Why are those the people? Who are the most eminently blessed people of the Iliad and the Odyssey? It's the Ethiopians. If you go back and read, the incomparable Ethiopians are people who lived at the edge of the known world, close to the river ocean, who were thought to be eminently blessed. And if you go back in the Odyssey, they had a special relationship with Poseidon. And who's the patron god of Atlantis? It's Poseidon. And there you can read it line for line. Obviously, Plato knew about Homer, and he's making a lot of references to it. And he's also making a lot of references to the original struggle for the patronage of Athens, which was between who? Athena and Poseidon. Who are the two gods backing the two city-states in the Atlantean War? Athena backs Athens, and Poseidon backs Atlantis. So we can kind of wrap it up there. But as I think I've shown you, the seeds of some incredibly powerful ideas are at work in this story. And I think that most of that's getting missed while people are out trying to prove the Azores Islands had some flying cars and free energy crystals and, dino DNA experiments.
Man, yeah, the fireworks were so appropriate, Jack. I loved the documentary a lot, but I honestly was pleasantly surprised at the depth to which you've put thought into the whole kit and caboodle. Not because you did such a great job kind of showing the bones of the story and the evidence that might exist in the real world to support it or not. But this philosophy side of the thing, clearly that was not lost on you, and you've put in the work over the course of life, not just for the sake of this particular film. So really excited that we got to have this conversation and meet. It definitely exceeded my expectations, as I'm sure you can relate to. There's only so many opportunities to have conversations of this depth. We don't have the Pythagorean Academy to rub elbows with other initiates, right? So this has been truly fantastic. You'll have to let me know when your book comes out, and I'd love to talk to you again. Or if you just want to mix it up in the future and have more philosophy chats, we'll have to do it. Is there anything you want to tell the people about where to find you, or other things that you might have going on online, or what might be coming next apart from this book? In closing thoughts.
Yeah, sure. Well, Chance, first of all, thank you so much for taking the time to have me on your show today. And, it's always a pleasure to be able to get into these conversations. And I think that by doing that, we're carrying on the traditions of philosophy. And this is what it's about, trying to figure out ideas that will benefit us as people and benefit those around us, right? So if people want to know more about the movie, atlantispuzzle.com, or my film production company, Empire Builder Productions, and you can click on the little Atlantis Puzzle poster, and there'll be, copies of interviews. We'll post this interview, links to this interview up there, and many others. And I just want to encourage, last thing I would say is I just want to encourage people to go out there and read these books for yourself. Don't take my word for it. Don't take Chance's word for it. Go out there and read them yourself, because there is so much, and there are so many wonderful things to be uncovered when you really start digging into these subjects. And they're not just a dry academic text. Don't go read a book about Plato. Go read Plato, because I think you're going to be pleasantly surprised at what an incredible author he is and how much you might be able to take away from his writing.
Amen. Couldn't agree more. All right, Jack, thanks again. It's been a blast.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Chance.
Ay, caramba. I don't even know what to say. So I'm saying ay, caramba. Never even say that. But that's how flabbergasted I am that we were able to have such a powerful conversation with Jack Kelley. Whoa. Because I saw the documentary a couple times, getting ready for the show. My pre-game preparations for the show were more along the lines of like recapitulating the contents of the documentary, which I was definitely hoping that we could go beyond that. Of course, you know me, I like to get straight to the deep end, but I did not realize, because the doc is great. Don't get me wrong. The doc is great, but based on the contents of the documentary, which kind of more hits in the middle for maybe a wider, more mainstream audience, I did not realize what a philosopher Jack himself was, because as a good director, narrator in his film, he kind of like defers to authorities of archaeology, geology, George with mythology. And he doesn't put himself in the position of an authority. He's showing what he's found. But on terms of his own deep thoughts on this stuff, very profound, far above and beyond what you actually would have guessed from seeing the film. Definitely not knocking the film in any way either. I think that's a good strategy for making a movie that can reach a wide audience, which hopefully it has. I think it's done all right on the streaming services. I heard about it on Mysterious Universe, which and I think that's probably done a lot of help to get it out there because that's a big podcast and he's probably done quite a few bigger shows than mine. But I hope that he hasn't had, and I like to think he hasn't had a conversation quite as deep as we had about this stuff. Probably not. Not tooting my own horn, but I'm tooting my own horn. I think that we killed it. Like, this was unbelievable, especially the second part. If you're not listening to the Plus extensions, supporting me on Rockfin or Patreon or through the YouTube membership, you're just not getting the whole story, you know? And in the second part, I'm not exactly sure where it's going to cut off from free to plus, but somewhere around the topic of the Pillars of Heracles and the Green Sahara period of the early Holocene. And then we got into some deep stuff about the importance of specifics with ancient syntax, how a here, you know, that here versus a that there makes a big difference in what's being said, and some other things that might change the framework of thinking based on someone's language operating system. We talked about the mysterious Rishat structure of Mauritania as a possible Atlantean remnant, which is something he does investigate very thoroughly in the documentary. And then really the rest of the plus portion was all philosophy. And that's, you know, as great as the first hour was, and it was great, the second part is where we started digging into, like, how can philosophy make our life better? Are we better off with the modern world and all of its accoutrements, or is the quality of life for the ancients actually better? This is a question that's being asked from as early as Plato and maybe before, because he's looking back at the proto-Athenians and like that they were the heroes, right? And there's also the possibility that Plato is projecting his own culture and modern experiences to his age on the ancient Atlanteans and Athenians. I think that's very likely. Part of that repeating of cyclical world age doctrine. We talked about all that with Jack in part 2. And just, you know, really digging into what is the value of this monomyth. And then Jack had a really great series of, I don't want to call them rants. The tonality is not a rant, but, you know, he went off on how and why esoteric versus exoteric works. Why are things written in these rings of meaning and layers like that? We talked about whether or not Homer was a real person or a pseudonym for multiple people potentially. And talked about astrotheology. Man, it's almost like it's a vibe. It's hard for me to even tell you exactly what was in this second part, because it's not really a soundbite, you know, 30-second clip summary possible type of deal. It's like a vibe, and that vibe was called wisdom. Absolute wisdom, man. Jack Kelley is a sage, dude. Like, I am surprised in all the best ways. I'm not that I was disappointed in his presentation in his documentary, but just to get to talk to the man, you know what it's like. You don't really know someone until you have a 2-hour plus conversation with them. And then when you get that reflectivity and the light is shining between the two mirrors of consciousness, and it's just amping up and amping up and amping up. And we just really got there. I feel so good about it. I'd love to have talked to him more about George Sarantitis, though, because that guy seems funny. Good old Yorgo. I love me some Greeks. And I bet he has some hilarious stories about that guy. And I actually, you know, it's fine because we still got a really good cast out of it, but I only realized a little bit before the interview with Jack that I could have gone and read the methodology of mythology that George Sarantitis wrote. So I'm going to look into that. He's given me a few other leads on some great literature that might add to the whole perspective that I do my best to build here on this show. All around, I'm just super stoked. For people that are new as well, so there's always new people, and I don't think I've done a great job with this lately. You got to know, there's a reason why, if you're watching the video of this podcast, that right there under my name, it says Aura Technician, because I am not just a podcast host. I do a practice called biofield tuning, which in a nutshell is using tuning forks as a tool to find stuck energy in your personal energy field, bring it back into the center where it can flow with the rest of your energy, thereby restoring your total access to your biological vitality, unlimiting things about your life and your personality that may have been constricted, improving things in your health that might have had problems because of this stuck energy. And it's a whole thing. And it's really powerful. It's really effective. We have so many success stories from clients all the time. I say we, it's me that does it, me and the client. So if that's something that sounds interesting, I'd love for you to go check out the links in the show notes here, or go to my website, hit the tab that says Get Tuned, or in the links below, it's going to be innerversepodcast.com/sound-healing. All kinds of info there if you're just curious what the heck I'm talking about, and information that will give you a better understanding of your energetic anatomy, even if you don't pursue a session with me. So I want to teach that as much as I want to practice that. But it's super important that some of you do get sessions with me, because that's how I support myself and my family, typically more so than just podcasting. Podcasting is great, but it's when you are like me and you're very anti-ads, it's not the easiest way to make a living. I don't even ask for much. You can get my Patreon for $5 a month and get the second half of this conversation, even if you just want this one. It's worth $5. Heck, you'd pay that about to watch a documentary that's only a little longer than an hour. And with me, you get the whole archive for the month with that $5. So check that out. I mean, at this point in 2024, I'm barely asking for anything. That being said, the tunings do a lot better support for me and my family, and they get to support you in a very direct way that can be life-changing. So I hope you at least go check out the page, see some of see what your biofield anatomy, your energetic anatomy really looks like. Other than that, there's Rockfin. That's a cool platform. You get a lot of other creators whenever you join that network, as opposed to the Patreon. Or if you just like to stay on YouTube, I do put all these episodes on YouTube under the membership tab, which shouldn't be too hard to find if you know what the heck YouTube memberships are about. You can do that too. Speaking of tuning clients, check out this big, chonky piece of orgonite I got here. This thing is a beauty. I've never had anything like it. I'll probably on a vibrant take it off and show it up closer, but it is super powerful. And for this conversation with Jack, it's the first time I ever wore it. I felt great about that. I think it was at least as good as the nice piece of whatchamacallit that I usually wear. I'm just totally blanking. Larimar. That Larimar is good stuff too. But I just got to give a shout out to my boy Jonah, who is a repeat client. Not only does he get tunings with me, but he gets tunings for his family too. So he's been a huge supporter. And I really appreciate that, especially as our baby is getting very close, a month or less away. Holy crap. A little bit scared in a good way. Just part of me knows life is never going to be the same. It's going to be better, but there's trepidation with that, but I'm stoked. So lots of good reasons to support your favorite podcast host, right? Least of which is my imminent transformation into fatherhood. Yeah, I think that's all I want to talk to you about. Well, there's lots of great ways to support the podcast besides those ones. I should tell you about them. There's Lotus Way, excellent flower essence, elixirs, and sprays, and a few other products they got. The link in the show notes, lotusway.com/InnerVerse, is going to give you the affiliate connection where whatever you purchase there gives me a kickback. Very kind. Even better, I don't want to qualify, but I've been using it way longer. Tippecanoe herbs, absolutely incredible. My friend Kyle and his wife Serena, who they're also about to have another baby. So very worth supporting. If you use the InnerVerse code at checkout, you get 10% off of Tippecanoe herbs. They've got tinctures. They've got dried bulk herbs. They've got salves. They've got teas. They've got more than that. They've got all kinds of stuff. They are awesome. And all their products have some kind of clever, fun little punny name that's going to just give you that much more excitement about using it. So please check it out. And I think I'm out of here. I am incredibly stoked about this combo with Jack. I've been facing maybe a little bit of burnout, stress. There's just a lot I'm juggling. And so when I can have a conversation like this level of philosophy, I learn some stuff. I see things a new way. It fires me up. I love life. I need this. I like this is I have these reminders all the time, but a conversation like this one with Jack is exactly why I do this. I need this. This is for me. And I hope that I can share this thing that I need to do with you guys and that you get something out of it too. I know you do. You're the best audience around. Love you guys so much. Hope you're having a great time whenever, wherever you are. See you for the next one. Take good care out there. Much love. Bye-bye.